Ladies and gentlemen, you need to understand this. The greatest strength of a super empath is not that they love harder than everyone else. It is that they love with a depth that makes people feel seen, even when they don't know how to be seen. They don't love in half measures. They don't love for attention. They don't love to win. They love because their heart naturally reaches for the truth inside people, even when those people are wrapped in walls, silence, and distance. And that is exactly why, when a super empath finally withdraws that love, it becomes the harshest lesson an avoidant will ever experience. You need to understand how this starts, because it never begins as a warning sign. It begins as chemistry. It begins as curiosity. It begins with the avoidant being drawn to the empath's warmth, like someone standing outside in winter stepping into a room with fire. The empath feels different. They listen differently. They notice details. They remember what you said. They soften the sharp edges in you. And the avoidant, who has learned to survive by staying emotionally guarded, finds themselves relaxing in that presence. Not because they suddenly become secure, but because the empath makes it easy to be close without feeling trapped. The empath doesn't demand, they invite. They don't pressure, they reassure, they don't threaten, they understand. And to an avoidant, understanding can feel like safety. So the empath gives. They give patience. They give the benefit of the doubt. They give space when asked, even when it hurts. They give forgiveness quickly because they can see the fear behind the behavior. They tell themselves, this person is not cold, they are scared. They tell themselves, if I keep showing them love, they'll learn it's safe. They tell themselves, if I just stay steady, they'll stop running. And for a while, it looks like it's working, because the avoidant comes closer, then pulls away, then comes back again, and the empath keeps interpreting the returns as progress. But you need to understand what happens quietly underneath that pattern. Each time the avoidant withdraws, the empath has to swallow something. They swallow disappointment, they swallow questions, they swallow needs, they swallow the ache of inconsistency. And because they are emotionally intelligent, they don't want to be unfair, they don't want to be too much, they don't want to overwhelm, so they become careful. They become smaller. They become the version of themselves that is easiest to keep. They start editing their feelings. They start timing their messages. They start double-checking their tone. They start holding their breath around someone who claims to care but can't stay present. And the empath might not even notice at first, because love can be a beautiful excuse to ignore your own pain. The avoidant, meanwhile, grows comfortable in the arrangement, not because they're evil, but because it requires less of them. They get closeness without accountability. They get devotion without consistency. They get warmth without having to fully step into vulnerability. They learn that the empath will carry the connection, will bridge the silence, will soften the conflict, will keep the door open. And even if the avoidant doesn't plan it, they start expecting it. They start relying on it. They start living in the comfort of knowing no matter how far I pull back, they'll still be there. And then, one day, the super empath reaches a moment that looks small from the outside, but is huge on the inside. It's not a scream, it's not a scene, it's not revenge, it's clarity. It's the quiet moment where they finally see the truth that love is not supposed to feel like constant waiting, that connection is not supposed to feel like uncertainty, that devotion is not supposed to cost you your peace. They look at themselves and realize, I am becoming someone I don't recognize. They realize they've been trying to heal a person who keeps reopening the wound. They realize their kindness has become a doorway the avoidant walks through only when it's convenient, and something inside them decides, gently but firmly, I can't do this anymore. You need to understand, when a super empath leaves, they don't leave messy, they leave clean. They don't write 10 paragraphs to make you understand. They don't beg for closure, they don't bargain, they don't threaten. They simply stop. They stop chasing, they stop explaining, they stop rescuing the relationship from the consequences of the other person's distance. And that's why it's a harsh lesson, because it's not loud enough to hate, it's too calm to dismiss, and it's too real to ignore. That is the moment the avoidant feels the shock, not because they suddenly become romantic, but because the safety net disappears. The person who always responded doesn't respond. The person who always forgave doesn't reach out. The person who always held space now holds boundaries. And the avoidant, who used distance to regulate, suddenly finds that distance does not feel like control anymore. It feels like loss. Because the empath wasn't just a partner, they were a source of emotional stability the avoidant didn't know how to create inside themselves. The empath was the calm that made the avoidant's chaos feel manageable. And when that calm is gone, the avoidant has to sit with themselves, with their patterns, with the emptiness they kept avoiding. And the harsh lesson they will never forget is not, "You hurt me." The harsh lesson is, "You had something rare and you treated it like it would always be there." Because the super empath's love is not common. It is not easy to find someone who can see your fear and still choose you, who can understand your silence without turning cold, who can hold your broken parts without using them against you. The avoidant may act unaffected at first, but later, in quiet moments, they remember. They remember how safe it felt to be understood, how steady it felt to be chosen, how warm it felt to be loved without being forced. And what haunts them is not that the empath left, but that the empath had to leave to survive. Ladies and gentlemen, you need to understand the super empath's withdrawal is not punishment. It is self-preservation. It is a boundary drawn by a heart that finally refused to bleed in private. It is the moment love stops being a sacrifice and becomes a standard. And that is why it becomes a lesson the avoidant carries, because it teaches something unforgettable. Access to a heart like that is a privilege, not a guarantee. And once it's gone, you don't just miss the person. You miss the version of yourself you could have been if you had been brave enough to meet them halfway. Ladies and gentlemen, you need to understand this. An avoidant can survive a breakup, they can survive an argument, they can survive someone being angry at them because those things fit the story they already tell themselves. That closeness is messy, that love is pressure, that emotions are dangerous. But what they struggle to survive is something quieter, something cleaner, something that touches the part of them they work hardest to avoid. The moment they lose the one person who understood them without demanding they change. That is what shakes them because it removes the comfort of their distance without attacking them, and it forces them to feel what they usually escape. You need to understand how rare that kind of person is. The super empath is not someone who just likes you. They study you with their heart. They notice the small shifts in your voice. They sense when you're overwhelmed before you even admit it. They can feel the fear under your silence, the doubt under your jokes, the pain under your need for space. And instead of turning it into a fight, they try to make you feel safe. They don't ask you to be perfect. They ask you to be present. They don't try to trap you. They try to understand you. They don't shame you for having wounds. They simply hold you with kindness while you figure out what you feel. And to an avoidant, that kind of understanding can feel like oxygen, because avoidants often walk through life carrying this quiet belief, if people really need me, I will disappoint them. Or if someone gets too close, I will lose myself. Or if I let love in, it will cost me my freedom. So they learn to keep relationships at a distance. They learn to stay safe by staying controlled. They learn to be okay by being independent. And then they meet a super empath, someone who doesn't immediately demand more, someone who can sit in the space with them, someone who doesn't punish them for needing time. And for a while, it feels like relief because they finally feel accepted. But you need to understand what happens when acceptance becomes unconditional access. The super empath, because they care, keeps making room. Room for the mood swings, room for the disappearing, room for the I'm fine when it's clearly not fine. Room for the hot and cold, the mixed signals, the emotional half-presence. They keep making excuses because they can see the pain behind the behavior. They keep offering softness because they believe love can heal what fear has damaged. And that would be beautiful if it was met halfway. But when the avoidant stays the same, when the avoidant keeps choosing comfort over courage, that softness starts turning into a safety net. And a safety net can be dangerous because it allows someone to fall without learning how to stand. The avoidant starts thinking, no matter what, they'll understand. No matter how far I pull away, they'll still be there. No matter how inconsistent I am, they'll interpret it with compassion. And slowly, without realizing it, they begin to rely on the empath's kindness as proof that they don't have to change. They begin to treat the empath's patience as permanence. They begin to take what is rare and handle it casually, because the super empath makes loving them feel easy, even when they are difficult. You need to understand this part because it's the turning point. The super empath does not leave when they stop loving. They leave when they realize they are the only one doing the emotional work. They leave when they notice their own life shrinking around someone else's distance. They leave when they are tired of carrying connection on their back. They leave when they finally admit, quietly, I am exhausted. Not exhausted by loving alone. exhausted by having to earn basic respect, exhausted by waiting for consistency that never arrives, exhausted by constantly calming someone else's fear while ignoring their own pain. And when the super empath finally stops, it feels different than any other ending. It's not dramatic, it's not a show, it's not a threat. It's the calmest goodbye you will ever witness. The messages stop, the explanations stop, the rescuing stops. The empath doesn't disappear to punish, they simply remove access because they are done bleeding. And the avoidant in that moment feels something they didn't expect because they assumed distance would create relief, but instead, distance creates consequence. You need to understand why this is so unforgettable for them. When the empath leaves clean, the avoidant cannot blame it on drama. They cannot say they were too emotional. They cannot say they were controlling. They cannot say they were crazy. Because the empath's departure is quiet, respectful, dignified. It doesn't shout. It doesn't beg. It doesn't chase. It simply says, through action, I won't keep doing this. And that kind of clarity is painful because it highlights the truth without yelling it. It forces the avoidant to look at their own pattern without the distraction of conflict. And now comes the harsh lesson, the one that stays in their body long after the relationship ends. The lesson is not that the empath was too good. The lesson is that love is not guaranteed even when it is given generously. The lesson is that being understood is not the same as being entitled to someone's heart. The lesson is that when someone gives you softness, it is not permission to stay careless. Because the super empath's love, when it is present, feels like safety. And when it is gone, the absence feels like truth. The avoidant will remember the way the empath stayed calm when they were distant. They will remember the way the empath listened when they didn't know how to speak. They will remember the way the empath saw beyond their walls. And what will haunt them quietly is not losing the relationship. It is losing the one person who made them feel safe enough to be real and realizing they didn't protect it. Ladies and gentlemen, you need to understand, the super empath didn't teach a harsh lesson by being cruel. They taught it by finally respecting themselves. They taught it by closing the door they kept leaving open. They taught it by choosing peace over potential. And the avoidant will never forget it, because it is rare to meet someone who loves with that much understanding, and even rarer to meet someone who is strong enough to walk away when that understanding is taken for granted. Ladies and gentlemen, you need to understand this. The harsh lesson was never revenge. It was realization. It wasn't a dramatic exit designed to hurt them. It wasn't a speech meant to shame them. It wasn't a plan to teach them a lesson, the way people say when they are angry and trying to feel powerful. It was something far deeper and far more human. It was the moment the super empath stopped overgiving and the avoidant was forced to finally face what they had been running from the entire time, themselves. You need to understand how subtle this is, because from the outside, it can look like nothing happened. No screaming, no public drama, no messy back and forth. But inside that quiet shift, everything changes. The super empath doesn't wake up one morning and decide to become cold. They wake up and realize they have been living with a constant ache, an ache that comes from loving someone who only shows up when it's safe for them. They realize that their kindness has turned into a habit of self-abandonment. They realize that their empathy has become a way of excusing what should never have been normalized. They realize they have been trying to heal a person who keeps choosing distance over intimacy, comfort over courage, control over connection. And the super empath, because they are who they are, has probably tried everything before they ever leave. They have tried patience. They have tried understanding. They have tried giving space. They have tried gentle conversations. They have tried lowering expectations. They have tried not being too much. They have tried making love easy to accept. And you need to understand what that costs a person like this. Because every time they soften their needs to make someone else comfortable, they lose a piece of themselves. Every time they swallow what they feel, they teach their own heart that it must be quiet to be loved. Every time they accept inconsistency, they train themselves to live in uncertainty. And even if they don't say it out loud, their body keeps score. Their nervous system starts living on alert. Their mind starts overthinking. Their heart starts getting tired. Now, here is where the realization begins. The super empath finally sees that what they are calling love has started to feel like labor. that the relationship is not building them, it is draining them, that the connection is not mutual, it is managed, that they are not being met, they are being tolerated. And the hardest part is this: they can still feel love while also realizing it is not enough to save them. They can still miss the avoidant while also knowing the pattern will break them if they stay. That is the heartbreak inside the awakening, loving someone, and finally accepting that love doesn't grow where consistency is absent. You need to understand the avoidant often doesn't see the true cost while the empath is still present, because the empath protects the relationship from the consequences of the avoidant's behavior. The empath fills silence with care. The empath repairs disconnection with effort. The empath smooths over the sharp moments. The empath turns confusion into conversation. And because the empath keeps making it work, the avoidant never has to fully feel the impact of their distance. They can withdraw and still be loved. They can detach and still be welcomed. They can offer crumbs and still receive loyalty, not because they're evil, but because the empath's love keeps cushioning their fear. So when the empath stops, it's like removing a bandage that was covering a wound that never healed. Suddenly, the avoidant feels the rawness. Suddenly, the avoidant feels the absence. Suddenly, the avoidant feels what it is like to have their usual strategy fail. Because distance is supposed to give them control, but now distance gives them loss. Silence is supposed to protect them, but now silence exposes them. Withdrawal is supposed to regulate them, but now withdrawal creates emptiness. And that emptiness is the harsh lesson because it forces realization. They start replaying moments, not the big dramatic ones, the quiet ones. The times the empath stayed calm, the times the empath offered patience, the times the empath asked for simple things, clarity, consistency, emotional presence, the times the empath forgave quickly, the times the empath loved with their whole heart. And they begin to realize, maybe for the first time, that the empath wasn't staying because they were weak. They were staying because they were loyal. They weren't overgiving because they were naive. They were overgiving because they believed in love. They weren't asking for too much. They were asking for the basics. And now those basics are gone, not as punishment, but as consequence. You need to understand what happens next because this is where people get confused. The avoidant may reach out, not with a clean apology, not with full accountability, but with a test, a casual message, a hey, a reaction to a story, a small attempt to see if the old door is still open. Because they don't just miss the empath, they miss the comfort of being understood without having to change. They miss the safety of having someone carry the emotional weight. They miss the warmth that made them feel less alone without having to be vulnerable. And when the empath doesn't respond the way they used to, that is when realization deepens, because now the avoidant understands access was not guaranteed. It was a gift, and gifts can be withdrawn when they are mishandled. Ladies and gentlemen, you need to understand, the harsh lesson is not that the avoidant lost someone good. The harsh lesson is that they were shown, through the empath's absence, that love cannot survive without participation, that compassion cannot replace responsibility, that being understood is not a substitute for showing up, that you cannot keep someone by giving them uncertainty and expecting their heart to stay open forever. The empath's boundary becomes a mirror, and in that mirror, the avoidant sees the truth they've been avoiding. It wasn't that love was too hard, it was that they were too afraid to fully step into it. And for the super empath, the realization is just as powerful. They realize their love is sacred. They realize their softness is not something to hand out to someone who doesn't know how to hold it. They realize that being kind does not mean being available to pain. They realize that their greatest lesson is not what they taught the avoidant, but what they finally taught themselves, that peace is not selfish, boundaries are not cruelty, and walking away from inconsistency is not giving up. It is choosing a life where love does not require you to disappear. Ladies and gentlemen, you need to understand this. The harsh lesson they will never forget is not a fight. It is not a slammed door. It is not a cruel sentence meant to cut deep. The harsh lesson is quieter than that. It is the moment they realize that unconditional access is not unconditional love. And once that access is gone, the value of what they had becomes impossible to ignore. Because an avoidant can live with distance, they can live with silence, they can live with maybe, but what they don't know how to live with is the disappearance of the one person who made their distance feel safe. You need to understand how a super empath gives love, because it is different. A super empath does not just love what you show on the surface. They love what you hide. They love the parts of you that you don't talk about, the fears you pretend you don't have, the softness you lock away, the childhood wounds you don't mention. They notice the moment your eyes change. They feel the moment your tone shifts. They can sense when your "I'm fine" is a lie. And instead of punishing you for it, they move closer with care. They offer patience. They offer room. They offer reassurance without making you beg for it. They give you the kind of understanding that makes you feel like you can breathe, like you can exist without performing, like you can be imperfect and still be held with kindness. And that is why it becomes so easy, without anyone intending it, for the avoidant to start treating that love like it will always be there. The empath forgives quickly, so the avoidant learns they won't lose them easily. The empath explains calmly, so the avoidant learns they can stay confusing and still be understood. The empath stays loyal, so the avoidant learns they can withdraw and still return whenever they want. Not because the avoidant is a villain, but because fear creates selfishness. When a person is terrified of closeness, they reach for control. They regulate by pulling away. They avoid discomfort by going silent. And when they know there is someone waiting, someone who keeps the door open, someone who keeps offering softness, they don't have to face the full weight of their patterns. You need to understand this part. The empath's love can become the avoidant's cushion. The empath becomes the emotional home they return to when they're lonely, the warmth they borrow when life feels heavy, the reassurance they take when anxiety hits. But the avoidant does not always give back what they take. They don't always show up when the empath needs them. They don't always offer clarity. They don't always offer consistency. They keep things vague, not because they enjoy hurting someone, but because vagueness feels safer than commitment. It keeps the relationship close enough to soothe them, but distant enough to protect them. And the empath, because they see the good in people, keeps tolerating it, keeps hoping, keeps trying to love their way into a future that requires two people. Then comes the moment of truth, the moment the empath finally realizes that love is not supposed to feel like constant waiting, that affection is not supposed to feel like anxiety, that connection is not supposed to feel like guessing. The empath realizes that their kindness has been treated like a resource, not a treasure, that their softness has been handled like it's unlimited, that their emotional availability has been mistaken for permission to stay unchanged. And this is where the harsh lesson begins, not with anger, but with boundaries. Because when a super empath finally closes the door, they don't always announce it. They don't always fight. They don't always try to prove why they deserve more. They simply stop. They stop chasing. They stop sending paragraphs. They stop trying to translate someone's silence into a reason to stay. They stop offering access to a heart that keeps getting bruised. And the avoidant who has relied on that access as a quiet guarantee feels something unfamiliar, not just missing, but shock. Because they expected love to keep waiting. They expected understanding to keep excusing. They expected the empath to keep turning pain into patience. They expected, even if they didn't say it, that the empath would always be there. You need to understand what that moment does to an avoidant. It forces them to sit with the consequences of their distance. It forces them to feel the emptiness that the empath used to fill. It forces them to face their own patterns without someone else making them comfortable. And that is where the realization hits them, sometimes late, sometimes quietly, sometimes in waves. They realize that what they called space was costing them love. They realized that what they called independence was becoming isolation. They realized that what they called not ready was slowly turning into losing something rare. And the harsh lesson is this: the empath's love was not a free pass. It was not endless. It was not meant to be survived on without being honored. Because unconditional access makes people careless. When someone knows you will always answer, they stop valuing your time. When someone knows you will always forgive, they stop respecting the impact. When someone knows you will always stay, they stop becoming better. And the super empath, the moment they choose themselves, teaches the avoidant what no lecture ever could. They teach them that love can be deep and still have limits, that compassion can be real and still walk away, that understanding is not the same as tolerating pain, that being seen is a privilege, and privileges are revoked when they are abused. Ladies and gentlemen, you need to understand this lesson doesn't just sit in the avoidant's mind, it sits in their nervous system. It follows them into the next relationship, where they meet someone who doesn't understand them the way the empath did. It shows up when they try to recreate the warmth and realize it can't be forced. It shows up when they realize how rare it was to have someone who could hold their silence without turning cold, someone who could love them without needing to control them, someone who could see their fear and still choose them. And it shows up most painfully when they finally understand the empath didn't leave because they stopped loving. They left because loving without being valued turns love into self-destruction. So the harsh lesson they never forget is not a punishment. It is a truth. You cannot treat a devoted heart like a convenience and expect it to stay open forever. You cannot keep someone in uncertainty and call it love. You cannot keep taking warmth and offering distance and act surprised when the warmth finally walks away. Because when unconditional access ends, reality begins, and that reality is what stays with them. The understanding that love is not just something you receive. It is something you have to honor, protect, and meet with effort before it becomes a memory you carry for the rest of your life.